Remakes are a dime a dozen in the game industry, and they vary in quality and faithfulness. You have stellar remakes that are more or less direct upgrades, such as Resident Evil 1 on the DS, or the Zelda remakes on Wii U, and on the other end, you have remakes that are inferior in most if not every way, such as Sonic Colors Ultimate, or the Silent Hill HD collection. So when the Thousand Year Door remake was announced, I was floored and excited. Super Mario RPG got a very faithful remake with only a handful of bells and whistles added, for better or worse. And it had been 2 decades since we got a proper Paper Mario RPG. And as the trailers came out, I was getting more and more excited. The original one is one of my most replayed RPGs, second only to Chrono Trigger. So after a few months, 2 playthroughs of the remake, and 1 extra playthrough of the original for good measure, here we are with one of the most anticipated remakes. So does the Paper Mario Thousand Year Door remake achieve an honor like a New York Times bestseller, or is it about as disappointing as a first draft of 9th grade Shakespeare? After the hype dies down, is the Thousand Year Door remake good? Before this review begins proper, I would like to lay down some things about remakes, as this review will be split into 2 sections. The first part is judging this as its own game, as this is a remake that is rather faithful to the original, and the second half will be comparing this remake to the original. While the original is unfortunately not easily accessible, it is still a fair comparison, as it's trying to be the best way to play the Thousand Year Door. I think a remake should try to keep the core message of the original, and either try to upgrade the systems that are present in the original, or be unique in how it tackles mechanics and be a different experience with some familiar aspects. A good example of the first message is, as mentioned before, the Zelda remakes on Wii U, specifically Wind Waker. A good example of the latter is the Resident Evil 2 remake, as that remake and the original are very different to where both are worth playing. With that explanation out of the way, onto the review. The story starts with RPG Peach sneaking off from Toadsworth, and finding a treasure box that she was able to open, containing a treasure map that she sends to Mario. You make your way to Rogueport and are confronted with the antagonists exclusive to this game, the X-Nauts, a set of creatures that are in a cult and are after the map that was sent to Mario. You learn that the map is the location of the Crystal Stars, the MacGuffins of this game. Along the way, you meet some characters that help you out in battle, from a research assistant Goomba to an old Babam of the Sea, each with their own stories. The story as far as RPGs goes is simple, but effective. There's very few pace breakers, and the whole time you're reminded of the goal of rescuing Peach and getting the Crystal Stars. It's also helped with the intermissions given in the game. While Bowser is the main pace breaker in his usual egocentric antics, Peach takes a similar role to what she did in Paper Mario 64, of pushing certain details forward to the player, while also being an information carrier for Mario. The characters also echo the same idea, being simple but different from each other. While this story as far as Mario games go is great, the main thing the Red-Clad hero is known for is the gameplay. The gameplay is split into 2 sections, Overworld Exploration and Combat. Overworld Exploration involves you going around bing-bang wahooing your way through a variety of locales, solving light puzzles by using your partner's overworld abilities, or by newly introduced Mario abilities that turn him into all sorts of paper contraptions. The game has a lot of secret spots for collectibles that can give you extra goodies, so if you want to experience everything the game has to offer, you have to get creative in what can be done with the tools provided to you on a chapter-by-chapter basis. However, the exploration is not as focused when it comes to the core experience. The game is not centered around puzzle solving or trying to be an insane platformer, and that's fine. It serves as a way to break up the battles. However, if you're going into this game expecting the most enriching puzzles that you really have to think about, you won't find it here. But that's because the second section of gameplay is the main thing you're here for. The combat is a very standard turn-based RPG. You have 2 party members, being Mario and your partner of choice, beating enemies in a variety of Mario flared attacks, be it jumping on your opponents, getting your trusty hammer out for a good whack, using items like mushrooms and fire flowers, or using one of the special powers that you accumulate throughout the story, with each star corresponding to each story beat or boss. Such as when you fight a massive dragon that makes the screen shake, the crystal star allows you to conjure earthquakes. Your partners get in on the action with their own sets of attacks. Some are classic Mario fare, Goombella headbonks, Coom slotching himself at the opponent, Yoshi gulps enemies to spit them back out. And some are new species in Thousand Year Door, such as a wind spirit slamming herself, or a shadow setting stuff on fire. However, there are a few features that make the first 2 Paper Marios such unique RPGs. The first is timed hits, or action commands. The game adapts the exact same system as was present in the original Paper Mario, except adding some extra commands. All of your attacks require action commands, such as timing button presses before connecting with a certain thing, or holding the stick in a certain direction for a limited amount of time, and the same happens with defense, with one addition only present in Thousand Year Door. You have two forms of defense. The first is a regular guard present since Super Mario RPG, which allows you to take reduced damage. And the second is an evolution of the perfect guarding system from Super Mario RPG, with an added bonus called Super Guarding. In Super Mario RPG, if you guarded within a stricter window, you completely cancel out all damage from non-magic attacks. Thousand Year Door allows you to not only negate damage, but hit the opponent, stopping all future attacks in the chain, and dealing damage back to them. This timing is not only strict, but is also done with a different button, so if you mess up the timing, you're taking full damage from that attack. The second and third are tied together, being how level ups are handled and the badge system. Like most RPGs, you get experience points and level up once you hit a certain threshold. However, unlike other RPGs, you get to choose which one of your three stats you upgrade, being HP, FP, and BP. HP is health and is the driver of every other RPG. FP stands for flower points, which is this game's version of mana, or MP. And BP means batch points. This leads us into the third feature that makes Paper Mario games unique, with the aforementioned badge system. Badges can change how the game is played, such as giving you new moves, add effects, or make changes to certain mechanics. And not all of them are direct upgrades, as most of the ones that change mechanics have drawbacks. Coupled with everyone focusing on different playstyles of the game, alongside everyone having different flavor for badges, this allows every playthrough to be different. With Mario being a blank slate protagonist when it comes to abilities, and being able to so freely switch between partners, which all have different roles, and they don't need to be leveled, it creates one of, if not the most customizable RPGs that I've ever played. With other turn-based RPGs like Final Fantasy, Persona, or Pokemon, a lot of interesting decisions rely on crafting teams that suit playstyles, and team synergy becomes a very important factor in tackling the obstacles ahead. Whereas both of the Paper Mario games allow you to factor in what you want to focus on and how to approach the game, and is one of the few examples of where homogeneity in an RPG is not a problem, because of the fact that you have a 2-unit party and are able to cycle freely between partners and they all play a supporting role to what Mario brings to the table. Similar to how Chrono Trigger has a very strong cast of party members and it allows you to build whatever team you want at whatever point, Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door allows you to create your own Mario and freely swap about his badge setup. While yes, there are a few badges that are significantly better than others, there are also a lot of badges that allow for a certain level of expression by the player. However, it's not without its faults. The balancing is kind of all over the place, as there are party members that are just worse than others, the main ones being Flurry and the optional Miss Mouse, the latter of which just baffles me to this day. The same could be said for the Crystal Star powers, as there are several that are just better than others. However, as I previously mentioned, the overworld is not the focus of the game and it shows at points. I mentioned how I didn't mind the light puzzle nature of the game, but something that can bog the game down is the game's obsession with backtracking. There are smaller instances throughout the game, however there are a handful of chapters that have a very heavy-handed emphasis on backtracking, and there's nothing new in those retreads to make them interesting, as it feels like an escort quest, without the extra goal as a reward, but instead, a sigh of relief meaning it was finally over. At the end of the day, they are smaller complaints in the grand scheme of things. The game is a masterclass of an RPG, and is a very fun introduction into the franchise, and I cannot recommend it enough. But the question still remains, is this remake worthy of outclassing the original? This is why a lot of aspects have been glossed over in the explanation of the game, because it would be more succinct to cover them as handled in the original US version, versus the remake we have received. First off is the presentation. The game has gotten a significant improvement across the board when it comes to how the game looks. Areas look beautiful, bright, colorful, and background details have started popping out way more. Even then, the game knows when to have a scene be dark and moody. From the dazzling, serene nature of Bogley Woods, to the cold atmosphere of the Exnaut Fortress, to the background mural of Creepy Steeple, making it much more apparent in the remake. All of these details were present in the original, but they are way more visible in the remake. Also new to the remake are little intro animations for all the enemies, alongside new smaller details, like how Dupless preserves what costume you were wearing as Mario, rather than just having the default Mario costume. However, I feel at points the improved lighting has hampered one area, and it's a rather prevalent one. Rogueport looks bright and colorful in the remake, when in the original it looked disheveled and shady. There was a light fog in the air, further showing how dingy Rogueport looked. In the remake, this clashes with how shady Rogueport is told to be, but it looks warm, inviting even. It's similar to how the lighting of Persona 4 Golden changed the perception of many areas from Persona 4, but on a much smaller scale. The gameplay has received a few tweaks, mainly in the form of quality of life changes and decreasing tedium. The main thing is the addition of a pipe room. Brought over from Origami King, this is a hub for fast travel. The original had some of these pipes, but it was only for Petalburg, Bogly Woods, Keyhall Key, and Poshley Heights. This makes certain portions of the game much less annoying, as well as going back for collectibles that you missed. The game also has a percentage for collectors to see how many star pieces and shine sprites were collected in an area, which is nice to see which ones you've collected rather than looking up a guide on which ones you missed. Outside of the pipe room, some extra time savers were added, from small ones like adding a spring in Chapter 5, cutting down on the amount of time spent in one screen that you have to go back through several times, to the big one of adding a pipe to and from the creepy steeple in Chapter 4, cutting down on the amount of treks needed to do from 5 to 3. Some smaller things were added, such as the partner ring, allowing you to cycle between partners faster. Battles for the most part remain unchanged, as in enemy healths and damage you deal are unchanged, but some small things were tweaked, and one feature that I do think is my one big problem with this remake. The battles themselves are unchanged, as mentioned before. However, what has changed are the stage mechanics, timings, and rewards. In the original, random effects could happen, be it props falling, audiences being hecklers for better or worse, or fog rolling in. As you upgrade the stage, there are cannons at the front of the stage that could blast you, the enemy team, or both, with a freezing agent, explosives, or a flamethrower. This added an element of randomness that was at best a slight boon, but at worst could cost the battle. In the remake, several changes were made to the stage. Rather than having 3 nozzles that can point to anyone, and that could affect both the enemy or the player based on performance, but could also just aim at you or the enemy for barely any reason, now the stage has nozzles split into groups of 2, one focused on you or the enemy, that tilt down to deal attacks as mentioned above. Except when they don't, and I've only seen it happen to my side of the nozzles. The fog can now be side specific, rather than rolling fog over the whole field, and props now pierce defense. I'm indifferent to most of these changes. Sure, it made the game easier, but it's also a mechanic that I felt was added fluff in the original, to either benefit you luckily, or screw you over or waste your time. And any changes made in the remake don't really change my opinion on the mechanic. Same with the timings of attacks, as I got hit more often in the remake and flubbed attacks more in this version. But that's very much a me thing, and it's just old muscle memory having to be adjusted whether I'm playing the remake or the original. The frame difference I could kind of tell, as this game's frame rate has dropped to 30 instead of 60 like it was in the original. However, this very rarely matters, as this is not a game that needs split-second reactions and movement like a fighting game or a competitive shooter. My one biggest problem with the changes to the system is the rewards. The regular battles have the same rewards, star points and coins. My biggest issues are for the Pit of 100 trials and the bosses. A new thing in the remake are clear bonuses. For every boss you beat, you get a range from 50 to 200 coins, with Bonetail giving you 999 coins. And for every floor in the Pit of 100 trials, you get 5 to 20 coins. This is compensated with the fact that your max coin count has been increased to 9,999. But none of the prices have changed, and the game hands out more items. In the first 3 Paper Mario games, you don't have equipment you can buy. Coins are mainly spent on items. So as a result, you either have too many coins for no reason, or you can just buy an insane amount of items, making everything a breeze since you have not much to lose, as Jelly Ultras can be bought pretty easily. You can also restart encounters from the beginning of the battle, which for the most part are just nice to have. The main places you'll die are at bosses, and having to restart on battles just saves time between the save blocks. The one place I don't like having it is in the Pit of 100 Trials, as that is meant to be an endurance test, and restarting fights there defeats the point. For the most part, I find the difficulty changes to be inconsequential, as neither version is that hard. And unlike the Mario RPG remake that has made changes to make it easier by a considerable amount, the Thousand Year Door remake is maybe slightly easier at best? However, the remake does add a few bosses. Exclusive to this version, there's 2 bosses that have certain conditions to them that are recommended to be done endgame if not postgame. One of them I think is a really cool fun fight that straight up tells the player to get good, and I've wanted to fight in the original, so I was ecstatic when I learned that they added this character in particular to the game. The other one is really weird and is kind of a what the hell kind of boss pick. They're both nice additions to the game, but one is very clearly better than the other. I'll briefly mention this as it would be dishonest for me to gloss over this. yes, the script was changed. I noticed a few dialogue changes between the original US release and the remake. Most of the changes are to make it closer in line with the Japanese version, such as Hooktail being weak to frogs instead of crickets, and Vivian being trans rather than just bullied. And some were closer to head scratchers, like changing the initial Goomba squad to classists instead of creeps hitting on Goombella. There's still creeps in the original Japanese script. And removing the Russianness from bombs. It's still present in other international releases. Even with my bigger nitpicks of the dialogue, it honestly doesn't impact the enjoyment of the game in the slightest. And while yes, some of the aspects of characters have been toned down, it's not by a lot, and the story is still the same. The beats don't lose any of the charm or bite that the original had. The last part that I want to talk about is the soundtrack. Paper Mario games for the most part have had very memorable soundtracks, and in this remake you're allowed to change to and from the GameCube original, with a Nostalgic Tunes badge found in the badge shop, sold for 1 coin, and takes 0 BP to equip. This swaps out the new soundtrack for the old ones when it is applicable. Several new pieces that are not remixes were written for this game, and those cannot be switched out even with the Nostalgic badge, which is unfortunate, as a few songs get underutilized now, such as the Danger theme, which is played maybe once or twice in the remake, compared to its overutilization in the original. I think for the most part the new OST is pretty good. Most of the new songs are really good in my opinion. Some I like both versions of for very different reasons, and only a handful of songs that I think are just worse than the original. The main one that I and many other fans agree is weaker is the X-Naut Fortress. It lacks the distinct punch of the techno beat, and is instead replaced with the weak hits and more noise. It sounds more like a club beat, rather than a coal technology hideout that the X-Naut Fortress is supposed to be. And the progression muddies up the melody even further in my opinion. I also think the new Rock Hawk theme is weaker in this version. This is another case of muddiness, but also this is played in a different key that just sounds off. The second category of music that I like both versions of, but for very different reasons, the shining example of this is We're Counting on You, Mario. In the original, it had this aura of hope shining around it. The percussion was kept light to let the melody shine through, giving off the feel of, we believe in you, don't give up Mario and crew. It has the most Fire Embleminess in the whole game, which makes sense as the same composers were on both this and Path of Radiance. The remake, however, goes down a different path. The aura of hope is still present, but it's taking a backseat in this instance. The addition of rock elements such as the electric guitar having the melody, and the drum set being way more prevalent and more active, turns the original shining light into a burning inferno of energy, basically telling Mario and crew to get up and kick our ass. I think both versions are great in their own ways, but for very different reasons. The rest of the soundtrack is fantastic, as they're able to punctuate the scenes a lot better. Standouts include the new version of Sadness and Happiness, sounding like an actual music box. And the new progressing themes, such as the ones found in the Palace of Shadow, in front of the door, and the Pit of 100 Trials. A new addition to this version is separate chapter battle themes. The original battle theme is one that is timeless. No matter how many playthroughs happen, it still holds up as a great peppy battle theme. However, the remake introduces several new iterations of the battle theme. Alongside that, there are different intros depending on if it was a neutral battle opening, if you got the first strike, or if the opponent got the first strike, similar to how Paper Mario 64 handled it. My personal favorites go to Chapter 3's, Fives, Sevens, and the extra battle theme, which is played in Hooktail's Castle and the Pit of 100 Trials. Each battle theme punctuates the scenery and is able to increase the intensity in a fitting way. Each of these new orchestrations have also unique second and third melodies that make them all the better on repeats. Even the bosses get this love. The main one is each version of the Tail family. Hooktail, Gloomtail, and Bonetail all have the same boss theme in the original, which to be fair is amazing. Really gives off the imposing dragons some weight, as this is a much more serious battle theme than most of the boss themes in the game. And the remake for Hooktail is much of the same beat. Being very brass and string focused. Gloomtails is much more percussion prevalent, and replaces the punchy brass with a much more nefarious synth. And Bonetails is a rock and string cover that has a melody trading between that and choir. Makes it sound like a Dark Souls boss, and for a decrepit dragon stuck in a dark dungeon, it fits. So to answer the question that was posed at the start, is the Thousand Year Door remake a good version of the GameCube classic? Absolutely. Any of the complaints aside from one are nitpicks at the end of the day. Yes, the game is easier. It is unfortunate that the game doesn't run in 60 FPS, and it is easier to avoid enemies. But for a game like Thousand Year Door, does it really matter? The game was already really easy, as with none of the basic attacks or badge values getting changed, I breezed through both versions no problem. The 30 FPS isn't messing with the ability to connect attacks, at least for me, and moving faster than enemies makes the jaunts through repeat areas easier. The quality of life changes added were beneficial, the text changes are at worst a shame but nowhere close to being enough to impact the writing of the game or to be called censoring. The combat is just as good as it was in the original version, and more people get to appreciate this beloved RPG that was on the GameCube, alongside some added goodies like concept art and a music player. Even at full price this game is worth it, and an absolute steal on sale. So, after the hype died down, the Thousand Year Door remake is wonderful.